This is the Lose 10 in 4 podcast, episode number 7.
Welcome to the Lose 10 in 4 podcast. Simple habits for losing 10 pounds in 4 weeks and keeping the weight off forever. Submit your questions at makeyourbodywork.com. Here's your host, Canada's top fitness professional, Dave Smith.
Hey, thanks so much for joining me for today's episode of the Lose 10 in 4 podcast. This show is all about answering your questions about losing weight, getting fit, and just generally living a healthier lifestyle. Today, I have a really great question. It's from Kenneth in Vancouver BC. Let's dive right in. Kenneth, he gets straight to the point. He asks, what's the best way to lose visceral fat? Thanks so much for your question, Kenneth. And I just want to start by explaining the difference between our two main types of fat. The most common type of fat is called subcutaneous fat. And basically the way I like to describe that is imagine you put on a sweatsuit and it covers your entire body. It gives a little bit more bulk to your entire body. That's what subcutaneous fat looks like, except for it's underneath the skin. So as we accumulate more and more subcutaneous fat, it's like putting on extra layers of clothing, another sweater, another pair of track pants, and we get a little bit bigger and a little bit puffier with each level of this fat that's accumulated. Contrast this with visceral fat. So Kenneth, the type of fat that you referenced, picture a bowl. And in that bowl is Jello. And the bowl itself represents our abdominal cavity, and the Jello represents visceral fat. And if you think back to the 1980s, maybe 1990s, it was really popular if you ever went to a potluck dinner to bring Jello salad. And within that bowl of Jello, there would be suspended pieces of fruit or maybe raisins or maybe nuts, whatever it is. And those represent our organs. Well, if you have more Jello, there's more Jello separating those organs. Our organs get more spaced out. There's more Jello in between them. And that's the same thing that happens in our abdominal cavity. As we get more and more fat accumulating in our abdominal cavity, there's more pressure or there's more space being created between these organs because the fat needs a place to reside. Some visceral fat is definitely necessary because like that Jello separates the pieces of fruit, we need our organs to be separated. We need them to have some buffer zone or some cushioning for protection. So it is necessary that some visceral fat is there. But when we start to accumulate too much visceral fat, that's when all sorts of problems begin to happen. One of the problems, like I was alluding to, is just the physical pressure of having more visceral fat in our abdominal cavity. As the organs get more pressure, our blood pressure also tends to rise, which increases our risk for heart attack and stroke. Another problem with building up too much visceral fat is its impact on a hormone called adiponectin. And adiponectin is sometimes referred to as our fat hormone because of the role it has in regulating our metabolism. The problem with visceral fat is it actually inhibits adiponectin. So you can imagine this vicious cycle. The more belly fat or visceral fat we accumulate, the more it inhibits adiponectin, the more our body thinks it needs to store this healthy amount of fat, and the more fat we accumulate. Another big problem with visceral fat is its impact on our insulin sensitivity. Lots of research has shown that the more visceral fat a person is carrying, the more likely they are to develop type 2 diabetes later in life. Visceral fat has also been linked to mental health problems as people age and all sorts of other health problems that we really want to avoid. The next obvious question becomes, how much visceral fat do I actually have? And in the show notes, I'm going to link to a really interesting study that compares a couple different metrics for measuring fat. So they take a look at BMI, body mass index, they look at a body fat percentage, they look at body weight, and then they look at a ratio. It's called a waist to hip ratio. And basically the research is trying to figure out which of those measurements best predicts how much visceral fat a person has. And surprisingly, it is the simple ratio, measuring your waist versus measuring your hips. And as a general guideline for women, they want that ratio to be less than 0.8 to 1. If you took a measurement of your waist, and that's done around your belly button, and you divided that by the measurement of your hips, and that's done around the biggest part of your hips, ideally that ratio would be 0.8 or less. So it means that your waist is smaller than your hips. And that makes sense. That suggests a smaller waist, less abdominal fat or less visceral fat. For men, it's a little bit more. The ratio is 0.95. Less than 0.95 is a healthy ratio to be at. In the show notes, I'm going to link to that research study, And I'm also going to show you the different statistics that show what happens as your ratio increases. So for women, a 0.8 is your healthy waist to hip ratio, but as that grows to 1.0 or even beyond, that's when we start to get into a really risky situation for accumulating too much visceral fat. Same thing for men, except for the ratio in the healthy range again is 0.95, and you can see what happens as that number increases. So if you take a look at your waist to hip ratio and you're either in the moderate zone or maybe in a dangerous zone where you know that you need to do something, the question is, what can I do about it? How can I shed this visceral fat? I've got a really exciting statistic for you. For every 10% of body weight that you lose, you'll reduce your visceral fat by about 30%. That's a really reassuring statistic because it suggests that the more body weight you're able to lose, the even greater impact you're going to have on reducing your visceral fat. Visceral fat is one of the first places your body uses up its fat, in that abdominal cavity. So how do you do it? How do you reduce visceral fat? Well, it's the same way you reduce fat anywhere else in your body. I like to use the 5 pillars of fat reduction. Number 1 is eating a clean diet. Number 2 is exercising regularly. Number 3 is staying properly hydrated. Number 4 is getting enough sleep every single night. And number 5 is reducing your stress. Now, I'd love to go into greater detail for each of those 5 pillars of fat loss, but they're all topics that I've covered in other episodes of the Lose 10 in 4 podcast or on my blog. In the show notes for this episode of the podcast, I'll include links to some of the best resources for each of the 5 pillars, and you can take a look at the ones that you're most interested in. One really important thing to note when it comes to losing or reducing visceral fat is that there is absolutely no way to target visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat. So if you read of any diet or any particular workout program that says this is going to target your belly fat or your abdominal fat or your visceral fat, run away. It is not true. Our body distributes fat and burns fat based on its own genetic makeup, our own metabolism, and there's nothing you can do to pinpoint fat in one particular area of your body. That's why the 5 pillars of fat loss, again, clean eating, exercise, hydration, sleep, and reducing your stress, are so important. Yes, they are going to burn up subcutaneous fat. They're also going to burn up visceral fat. So your 10 in 4 takeaway for today is a reminder. Accumulating too much body fat is always going to lead to negative health consequences, but this is especially true for visceral fat. Visceral fat is linked to heart problems. It reduces our metabolic rate and it causes our body to store even more fat. It leads to type 2 diabetes, and the list goes on and on. So what I'd like you to do right now is to take that waist to hip ratio measurement. Grab a measuring tape and measure your waist around your belly button. Then measure your hips at the greatest circumference or the greatest distance around your hips. Grab a calculator and take that number for your waist and divide it by the number for your hips. Again, females were looking for 0.8 or less. Men were looking for 0.95 or less. And if your ratio is greater than that, it's time to take a closer look at the 5 pillars of fat loss and start making some simple changes in your life today. Thanks so much for joining me in this episode of the Lose 10 in 4 podcast. If you have a question for the show or a question in general, feel free to send me an email at dave@makeyourbodywork.com or visit my blog and drop your question in the comments section at makeyourbodywork.com. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to the Lose 10 in 4 podcast. If you have a question for a future episode, send it to Dave by visiting makeyourbodywork.com. See you next time.